Good morning, all, and a special good morning to all the early birds that are joining us just that little bit earlier before 9 o'clock. And welcome back to our continuing series of CPD webinars. This time it's all about atmospheric moisture and compliant ventilation. I'm Andy Ferguson from the Property Care Association. And joining me today is, I suppose, my buddy, my colleague, James Berry. Good morning, James.
Morning, Andy.
How are you, big chap?
I'm all right. I'm all good.
Well, guys, here, just apologise to all our regular listeners that know this already, but for those that don't, if you want to kind of engage with us, chat with us over the course of the webinar, then the first place I'm just going to point you to is to the chat facility within the platform itself. Now, if you're on a desktop or a laptop, depending on your settings, it should just be either to the left or the right-hand side. Don't be shy. Simply just go on there, type a wee comment, say hi. If you've got, again, any questions, shout out the questions. Tell us where you are in the world. If you're international, UK, just feel free to rattle it on there. Similar, guys, if you're on a mobile device, you'll have that functionality as well. This time, though, it will just be just below. You just need to pull your screen up and you will see it. Again, don't be shy. Feel free to chat and get in there, say hello. There is also, as well, folks, alternative ways that if you do have any kind of questions that you think about over the course of the webinar, you can reach out to us via email, which some do. All you simply need to do is just email me. Email me at andy@property-care.org. That's andy@property-care.org. Now, I know some of you out there, you are fairly socially savvy, and big thank you to all those, by the way, in the past that come on and say hello during the webinar and make those lovely comments. But if you are socially savvy, you can go via our social media channels. So either visit Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Simply just run a search using the native search functionality, Property Care Association. We should pop up and say a little hello to us. We always respond. I do promise you that. So if you do go that way, I will make sure to say a wee hi. Just as well, to let everyone know, I am aware that at 9 o'clock, there's generally quite a pool on the internet. Everyone's sort of jumping on board, starting their PCs at 9 o'clock for work. Doesn't help that Joe Wicks as well, starting at 9 o'clock, serving the nation, kids with PE. It has been known that from time to time at that 9 o'clock bit that sometimes the webinar might disappear for you. If that happens, there is a reconnect functionality that will pop up on the screen. And for anyone, if you see it on the chat when we're doing the webinar, feel free just to jump on board if anyone's having any problems and just mention to them about that button. You should connect right away onto the webinar, or at least I hope they do anyway. But we've got a couple of minutes to kind of kill just at the moment. I suppose, James, on to yourself. I mean, I have to say, I always love doing these webinars with you. We always seem to have a good laugh when we're kind of doing it. I mean that in a serious sense, of course, because this is we are a professional organisation, but it's always a little bit of good fun doing this with yourself, James.
Thanks, I think.
I'm not feeling the love here.
Well, absolutely. I'm just, a bit shocked. We've been going for 4 minutes and this is the first time I've had a chance to speak. But mind you, I'll have plenty to say in a bit, I guess. So
yeah, you get to steal the show for a full hour. Let me have these 3-4 minutes.
Absolutely, I don't want to steal your moment.
Well, guys, on a serious note, we do have an announcement that we do have to make, and I will say this: I'm a little bit annoyed with Joe Wicks because he's stolen our thunder with what he's announced this week as well. But important announcement, folks. As much as we've been doing these weekly webinars, and we have really been enjoying doing these weekly webinars, and I hope you guys have seen the value in these weekly webinars, we are, over the next couple of weeks, going to be reining these back and returning to, I suppose, our traditional format, which was we always were planning on doing these on a monthly basis and thinking of them as almost like breakfast bites, starting them at 8 a.m. and in the morning. And you'll well remember that, James, yourself being one of the pioneers on this and certainly helping me out in the first one.
Doesn't that feel like a long time ago now?
Oh God, it does. When you think how many of these that we've actually done now. I mean, we've effectively done more over the space of 2 months than we were planning over the whole year. And you think to yourself, that's just incredible. It really is incredible. But wow, what a blast. What a blast it's been. And what a busy time.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But, the numbers are slightly slower this morning, so that's probably good news. This probably means that a lot of people are now back out there and in the field and back to work. So we'll take that as encouraging.
Well, and that's also part of the reason as well why we're looking to kind of revert those back. I mean, we appreciate everyone is getting back to work and doesn't necessarily have the same sort of time to kind of join in and kind of tune in on the webinar in the morning. And it always was intended to be a monthly basis. And you can tell I'm sort of padding this out a wee bit as we're waiting for the numbers to kind of come on. Is this looking
all? We're not taking another 2 minutes, are we?
But folks here, just for everyone that's new and just kind of joining us, if you're wondering who the individuals are talking to you on the screen at the moment, hi, I'm Andy Ferguson. My colleague here just to the left of the right, pin your settings, is James Berry. And a big welcome to you to our webinar, Atmospheric Moisture and Compliant Ventilation. We are about to begin in the next minute or so. Just for those that are joining us, just so you've got awareness, if you are wanting to ask any questions over the course of the webinar, the best place you can point you to is over to the chat functionality. That on your laptop should just be over on the left or the right hand side. Just don't be shy. Feel free to just type any questions that you have there. On a mobile device, you just need to kind of pull it up and you'll see it in there. Also as well, that if you so chose to do so, you can also contact me via email, and that's just at andy@property-care.org. Well, James, I can see that it's just turned 9 o'clock there. I suppose it's probably a good time now maybe to pass over to yourself. So I suppose kind of raising the question, why do we need to think about ventilation a little bit more deeply, and why are governments, local authorities, and even ourselves at the PCA paying a little bit more attention to it? What do we need to do better? James, I know you've done the research. Over to yourself, good sir.
Morning, Andy. Yeah, so Steve, yes, I am in the office, hence the beautiful background behind me. But there we are. So, and Andy, I've got a question on this slide because I have no idea what this holding slide that you've made for me has to do with ventilation whatsoever. There's some lovely clouds on the door, but you've lost me on that one. So,
are you slagging off my artwork?
Yeah, I am a little bit. It looks right, but I'm a bit lost on the importance of ventilation. That is more to do with ventilation. So, compliant ventilation. I like to start with a couple of statistics, as it were. Now, this comes from an all-party parliamentary group white paper looking at healthy homes and buildings. It states that it is estimated that the effects of poor housing in the UK on the NHS is £2.5 billion per annum per year, which I think is quite a large amount of money. But then the paper also goes on to say that the actual total social and economic cost is closer to 19 billion per year. So huge volumes of money due to unhealthy homes. And you consider it's not like we're now living in, Victorian times, the Dark Ages. This is, 2020. We should, the very homes that we live in should not be having this impact on our health. And I think that's quite poor. Another statistic that comes out of that paper, and I'm sure it's something that a lot more of you will probably be able to relate to, is that it also says, well, this is an NHS statistic. It says that 1 in 3 properties has mould. And I'm sure most of you go out there, you see it on a daily basis, and you'll be sort of fully aware of that. I'm also not naive enough to think that, the whole of that 19 billion or even the 2.5 billion is to do with dampness. I do think it's a consideration in there. I don't think it's the only consideration. Obviously, noise, overpopulation, that sort of thing. There's numerous factors in there, but I think dampness is one of the key ones in there as well. And obviously, as I say, this has come from an all-party parliamentary group white paper, so it is getting noticed at high levels. And off the back of that, I'm not saying that's the sole driver, but we've also seen the introduction of the Homes Act, which was about a year ago now, well, just over a year ago, which was in March 2019. The Homes Act was introduced to essentially make landlords more accountable for making homes fit for human habitation. One of the key areas they look at on this is damp and some of the others as well, overcrowding and noise, etc. But what it does is it gives means for tenants, whether it be private or social, to have means to be able to sue landlords or seek compensation should they have a home unfit for human habitation. So there is certainly a spotlight on it. The one thing to note about this act is originally, when it came into force in March 2019, it was only for new tenancies. Now, as of March 2020, it was rolled out to existing tenancies. And I know there's been a lot of sort of concern and a lot of sort of worry about what this is going to mean. Simple truth is, given where we are in the world at the moment, things are not as we would expect. So this sort of crept in when sort of COVID was very much taking hold. So there is no case law, there's no one really knows where we're going to go with this. But having seen sort of a number of articles, it's looking for that one bit of case law to set the precedent, as it were. But there's several things out there. I've seen an article suggesting that even things like a broken window, if you cannot open a window, would mean that there is insufficient ventilation. You cannot do your purge ventilation. You cannot moderate temperature control, and therefore fits a means of the house wouldn't be fit for habitation. So interesting. It'll be interesting to see where the world goes with this. But ventilation is sort of why we're here today. But what is ventilation? Well, this is from approved document F, and it says that ventilation is simply the removal of stale indoor air from a building and its replacement with fresh outside air. So essentially, it's bringing fresh air in. Stands to reason. That's the official definition from approved document F. But what do we need it for? For a number of reasons. Firstly, supply of air for breathing, quite important. We don't have air, we can't breathe. That's pretty major. Dilution and removal of pollutants, control of humidity, air for fuel burning appliances, and temperature control. So we're going to focus on one aspect of that today, which is very much the control of humidity. But makeup of air is vital for many reasons, not just the prevention of condensation and mold growth and the control of humidity, but there are other reasons why we need to be considering the importance of ventilation. And primarily, to provide a healthy habitat. So I'm now going to try and explain the mechanics of condensation and mould, which is not always easy. So I'll give it my best shot, and I'm going to go on a bit of a rant now. I think as an industry, I think not just an industry, but sort of a bit beyond that, I think we get quite flippant when it comes to diagnosing of condensation issues. I think we're all too keen to say it's a lifestyle issue, and I'm not particularly keen on the term personally. I think that there's much more involved in it than that, and we're going to look at that today. I think we're too keen to say if you go into a property that it's down to the occupants, it's the way they live their lifestyle, that they're creating too much moisture. But there's more to it than that. And mold and condensation is caused by an imbalance in the internal environment, and there's several factors that are involved in that. And you'll see from the list there. So moisture production is certainly one of them. Ventilation is one. And ventilation, I think, can sit in two camps, because it could be down to the way the tenant uses or the occupant uses that ventilation, but it could equally be down to, is that ventilation sufficient? Heating, again, it could be a lifestyle thing, but then there's other things to consider. Family economics can affect heating as well. So it might be a lifestyle thing, but is the building fabric or the building element sufficiently warm? Will it retain heat, etc.? And surface temperature as well. So I think while some of those are certainly down to the occupant, the inhabitant, as it were, I think some of those areas might fall outside the control of the lifestyle, as it were. So I don't think it's necessarily all about that, and I think sometimes we need to take a more holistic approach rather than just blaming those that are inside the property, as it were. So I'm going to talk a bit about sort of what condensation and mold growth, and I've very consciously made a distinction between condensation and mold growth. So condensation is when water goes from its gaseous phase to its liquid state. And that happens when we get to 100% relative humidity. I appreciate I'm probably going to be teaching a lot of you to suck eggs, but I think it's important that we understand this. So I'll sort of run through this sort of relatively quickly, as it were. But so condensation is water from gaseous phase going to its liquid stage. That happens at 100% relative humidity, which is known as dew point. Relative humidity is probably best described as the amount of water in the air expressed as a percentage of the maximum amount of water the air can hold at a given temperature. I'll probably say that again just in case it didn't make sense, but relative humidity is a percentage, well, is the amount of water in the air expressed as a percentage of the maximum amount of water that air can hold at a given temperature. So to try and put that into easier terms, I quite like this little diagram. So essentially, the amount of water air can hold will change based on the amount of, based on the temperature. So the higher the temperature, the more water the air can hold. Now, RH isn't a perfect parameter, but it is the one that's responsible for condensation, as it were, because when we get to 100%, we know condensation's occurring. So it's a good indicator, but it's relative. And by relative, I mean it's not a precise amount of moisture. So it's not grams, it's not a defined quantity, it's a relative amount compared to the amount of water the air can hold at a given temperature. So this little diagram here I quite like, and I'll try and explain it best I can. But if you can imagine, so at 20 degrees, so in all of these diagrams, the air is holding the same amount of water. But at the varying temperatures, the air has a different capacity to be able to hold moisture. So if you can imagine your typical scenario in a building at night, it may sort of, when the occupants are in, they've got all the heating in, it might be 20 degrees. During the course of the night, they turn the heating off and the temperature drops. So where at 20 degrees, that amount of moisture will equate to 60% RH. Dropping it down when the temperature gets to 15 degrees Celsius, it gets to 83% RH. And then at 12 degrees, it then reaches capacity, 100% RH, and that's when you will get condensation occur. So I hope that makes sense. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to try and explain, particularly not briefly. So that's why you tend to see it when there's you will see it when there's a drop in temperature. But I hope that makes sense to you. But very much governed by temperature, and that's the one thing to bear in mind. It's not a quantifiable amount. Now, I did say that the one thing I was very conscious to try and do was differentiate between condensation and mold growth. Now, the two are linked, very much linked, because they're both symptoms of high humidity. However, condensation, by definition, is when you get to 100% RH. Mold growth can occur well below that. Now, mold growth is all you require is high humidities, and I think it, dependent on the substrate, it can happen as low as, I think, on fiberglasses, things like that. It can happen as low as sort of certain types of substrate. It can happen as low as sort of the 50s, but in most building materials, etc., it's accepted that we're probably looking around sort of 65% RH, but it's very much given influenced by time as well. So in approved document F of the building regs, which looks at means of ventilation, it says that for if you had 1 day at 85% RH, that would be sufficient for mold germination. 1 week at 75% average RH would be sufficient for mold growth. And then 1 month at 65% average RH would be enough for mold growth as well. So there is a key distinction. That's why, and I personally feel, you know, this is, I think actually when you've got severe condensation and lots of liquid water on the wall, I think that actually makes the conditions too adverse for mold growth. And when you do see that in the corner of the rooms, when you tend to see that liquid water running down the walls, I think actually the conditions there are too wet for mold growth to occur. Now that's sort of more of a personal hypothesis more than anything else, but you know, I think when you think about it, that seems to be the case. So I've mentioned a lot about regulations already now, but what are the regulatory requirements and guidance related to ventilation in the UK? And I've mentioned one in quite a lot of detail already, but it goes well beyond that. I've referred to the one in the top left-hand corner there, approved document F in some well, not depth yet, but we're going to go into it in more depth. But there are other documents as well, and this is the complexity of ventilation that I want to try and illustrate here. So there are, and this, you know, each of those approved documents being treated in isolation seems to be one of the big problems that come out the back of the Hackett report, as it were, and the review of building regs. But when you look at ventilation, these are all the documents that you will need to consider. You can't just look at approved document F in isolation. And this is a bit of a caveat because we are going to look at F in a lot more detail today. But there is more to it. And some of these other documents you need to consider include the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide, part L1, well, L1A, if you're looking at new builds, L1B, obviously conservation of fuel for existing home, L1B for existing homes. And there's others, part B, which is fire regs, which obviously getting a lot of attention at the moment and going through revisions, as it were. Approved document J, which is fuel burning appliances, so again needs to be considered. And of course the obvious one is which is P, which is your electrics as well. So there's a lot of considerations. It's not just about the ventilation. There's other considerations that you need to be looking at as well. So as I say, we're going to be looking at F in more detail today. So what is F all about? It says here, the key aim of the requirement of Part F is that a ventilation system is provided that under normal conditions is capable of limiting the amount of accumulation of moisture which could lead to mold growth and pollutants within the property that originate from within the property. So essentially, Part F is all about stopping mold growth. Simple as that. That's the key parameter on this one. But let's have a look at it in a bit more detail. And I'm hoping, come on. There we are. So, what are the requirements of approved document F, which you will have clocked that I've already shortened to ADF. So if I refer to it as that, that's what I'm referring to. So, requirement of approved document F. There shall be adequate means of ventilation provided for the people in the building. That seems perfectly reasonable and understandable. Number 2, fixed systems for mechanical ventilation and any associated controls must be commissioned by testing and adjusting as necessary to secure the objective referred to in the first one. So this testing and commissioning of ventilation systems is quite an interesting concept. So let's have a look at that in more detail. So they're the requirements. What it's saying is there should be enough ventilation within a building to make sure that the occupants within that building are, fit and healthy. It's not detrimental to them. And that when it's installed, it should be tested and commissioned to ensure that it's doing so. Sounds fairly reasonable. So let's look at that commissioning phase, or that sort of requirements in a bit more detail. So again, it's saying that all fixed mechanical ventilation systems where they can be tested and adjusted shall be commissioned, and a commissioning notice given to building control. So they're now saying that not only has it got to be tested and commissioned, it should be tested, commissioned, and it should be reported to building control. And then the other one, which is quite interesting in this, is number. And the other thing I should point out, of course, is that very clearly states all fixed mechanical. It doesn't differentiate between new builds and existing builds. They're saying all. So that's all ventilation systems. And then point 5 as well. So this is, the owner shall be given sufficient information about the ventilation system and its maintenance and the requirements so that ventilation system can be operated to provide adequate airflow. How often are you seeing that after a fan's being installed into a property, even on new builds? So I'm hoping, Andy, you're still listening and you're still awake. So we're going to ask sort of just off the back of that. So I want to get people's views here. So approved document F. I assume that's meant to be approved document 7, Andy. F, but there we are. So in your opinion, hopefully Andy's going to push out a poll for me now. Andy?
I have so, folks. So my apologies if I've done the typo there, James, but everyone, there should be, hopefully now, we pop up on your screens. If you're on a mobile, you might need to just push it up a little bit, but there's 4 answers on there. If you just want to basically submit what you think, tell us what you think, hit submit. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes just because I am aware there is sometimes a little bit of a lag with our audience in terms of where they are in the listening experience. So I'm just going to give it about another 10 more seconds or so just to allow some answers. So folks, if you're going to answer, now is the time. James, I can tell you there seems to be pretty much 2 clear winners at the moment. I'm not going to tell you what those answers are.
I can see it, Andy.
Can you see it? Can you see it, right, guys? Just another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that is the poll ended. Hopefully everyone should see the results. But James, over to yourself just to discuss.
Oh, a couple of people, it sounds like they haven't got it, but there we are. So that's quite interesting. So can they see the results, Andy? I'm not sure if people...
They sure can. They sure can.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, what's quite interesting, I find, is that, well, nobody thought that every installation applied was in accordance with building regs. Isn't that a bit concerning? There we are. Most sort of said between 10 and 30. I hate to disappoint you guys. To be honest, I don't have a definitive answer, but I thought it would be quite interesting to see what industry's thoughts were as to what the standard of installs for ventilation systems were, and quite a nice little statistic, perhaps, that we can use. So as far as I don't think there's an official answer to that question, but I think this puts a little bit of perspective on it. So this was a study done by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government in conjunction with ACOM. I think it came out in 2018. Oh, in fact, I know it came out in 2018. It's a pretty good little study. It looked at a study of 80 homes across 7 developments, 2 new build developments in England between November 2015 and February 2016. Now, 55 of those homes were System 1 and 25 was System 3. Now, we will look at those types of system in a bit more detail, but rather sort of crudely for now, System 1 is essentially your traditional extract fan, sort of your typical screw fix type, on-off type extractor fan. System 3 is a continuous running fan and a bit more sort of this industry is moving more towards System 3 for reasons we'll look at in more detail in a minute. So out of those 80 homes that they looked at, how many do you think were installed in accordance with the building regs? That should give you a good clue. So out of the System 1s, only 2, and out of the System 3s, just 1. So I guess, if we're looking at that, more or less, we're probably looking at 5% based on this study, based on the poll we sent out. But and crude math, someone would probably know that a bit better than me, but we're probably there or thereabouts. So, but there we are. So, you know, that's quite worrying, really. So this is how many houses are being installed in accordance with building regs, you know, and these are new builds, and not many. So this is new builds. Now, new builds are when it's ideal conditions, you know, you've not got occupants to deal with, there's no mucking around, you know. We can't get it right in new builds. We can't get it right in the optimum conditions, the right amount of information, the right commissioning isn't being done, and we're still not getting it right. Bearing in mind, we're building, what, 300,000 houses a year. It's probably less than that. I think that's the target. So we're probably not even that high. But our existing building stock is sort of 27, 28 million homes. So we can quite comfortably say that the majority of the housing stock hasn't got sufficient ventilation, which is quite a big issue. And how are we doing with our existing housing stock? Well, Tony Francis, I haven't asked, you know, you sent me this picture and, you know, I thought it was quite a nice one to use. How are we getting it right? Well, based on this, it looks like we haven't really got much of a clue. Now, this is I won't name and shame, but this was a housing association's attempt to cure condensation in the kitchen cupboard, from what Tony tells me, and it's quite mind-boggling, isn't it? You know, that's quite something. But there's other considerations as well when we start looking at new builds or existing homes as well. So this one, a picture from Neil, so thank you for this one, and one I quite like using a lot. I won't dwell on it too long, but quite clearly you've got in the eaves there, you can see where the joists are and where the uninsulated eaves are. But these are all additional considerations for existing buildings. So the issue is obviously a lot more complex. And when we're approaching dampness in existing buildings, this is why, you know, the PCA particularly are advocating this holistic approach. There is more to it. It's not straightforward. There's other things to consider, the building envelope, as it were, thermal element, the thermal properties of it, that sort of thing. And another slide just to illustrate this. So I'm hoping you're all sucking through your teeth right now. And I know many of you have probably seen a lot of these before. I know they were taken by Steve, and, you know, just right with issues that are likely to result in differences in the or cold bridges and elements of the building envelope that are going to result in condensation and mold growth problems. And these are all additional considerations, you know, and these aren't exclusive to existing buildings, but the tweaks, the alterations that we make with our existing buildings that we need to be considered as well, that may be causing problems. So the point I'm trying to make is that whilst we're quite flippant and say that it's down to occupant lifestyle, and that seems to have been the go-to sort of phrase in the past, there is a lot more to consider. My particular favourite is that top left-hand corner with the timber fencing. So you've got the timber fencing with a life expectancy of what, years, and then you've got the insulation, which is guaranteed for 25 years. So you've got that cold bridge going, you know, where they've cut around the insulation. It's just horrific, isn't it? But there we are. So I'm going to bring this back, hopefully. Come on. Back to commissioning, because I think it seems off the back of that poll, everyone has agreed that already it doesn't sound like most ventilation installs are being done properly. So how do we commission? So we're going to look at that process in a bit more detail. So mechanical ventilation systems that we've tested, we've got that. So how do we, so what part of that process is to test the ventilation system? And we do that for anyone who's can't actually see what you're seeing, but this is an anemometer, and that's an essential bit of kit for testing ventilation systems to ensure that you get adequate flow rate. So just moving on. So every install of an extractor system, a ventilation system, needs to produce sufficient output. So on this table, we've got intermittent fans, which is your system 1, the most common ones, and your continuous running fans, your system 3. Chose these because they're probably the most common too. And here you can see the flow rates that you should be looking to achieve to comply with building regs. So you should be using a fan like that or similar equipment to be able to test if the flow rates are right. And these are the minimum rates there. So this is building regs. And the one thing I haven't commented on yet, there are, it should be reported to building control in advance. There's 3 exceptions to reporting to building control in advance. One is that you're a competent person through schemes like, and I should probably, it's not just an electrical competent person that they need to be. They need to be a Part P competent person to be able to do the electrics, but they also need to be a competent person for Part F. So someone that can commission a ventilation system, and there are schemes through BPEC, I think NAPIT have one, EIC, a competent person for ventilation, not just electrics. And I think this is part of the problem, and why we're seeing the compliance rates that we're seeing is that too often the ventilations are installed by people that don't appreciate they've got to be a competent person for Part F as well as Part P. The other exceptions for not notifying in advance are if it's minor work, so you're looking at sort of old fixing fans, things like that, or emergency works. So there are 3 exceptions, but the vast majority you're either going to need to notify in advance, which, let's be honest, we know is not happening, or a competent person. And unfortunately, most of the installs are being done by people that probably don't have that or have little for regard for what they're doing. So back to ventilation rates. So every install, so you need to be testing to make sure that what you're getting complies with the building regs. And these are the rates. So you can see, you know, for a kitchen, it is 30 litres, where adjacent bathroom, 15, are probably your 2 most common ones. One thing I'm keen to try and stress here as well is that they're minimums. We shouldn't look at the building regs as a target either. They're not. That's not what we should be aiming for. That's the minimum of what we should be achieving. You know, that's not a goal. That's not what we should be aspiring for. That's the minimum of what we should be achieving, and it's just not being happened. That's, you know, the building regs are there as the minimum standard we should be achieving. I obviously showed you the anemometer, but a couple of other things on commissioning as well. Though, what you can see there, the one on the right hand side there is a powered hood. Now, the one that I showed you before, you'll need to do correction factors. I won't go into too much detail on the methods of testing, but the one you've got on the right there is a powered hood anemometer, and that essentially does all the work for you. So if you can afford one, they're always preferable. But all of your anemometers should be calibrated as well by UCAS. So if you're commissioning, the equipment needs to be calibrated to be able to do that as well. The information as well. So as I mentioned sort of towards the beginning, you should also be leaving ventilation, the documentation for the user as well. So how to maintain the system, so because we've all seen ventilation extractor fans when you go in and it's clogged with dust, and you know it's never going to have the efficiency it would have done when it was the day it was put in. So they need to be aware of how they can maintain the efficiency of that fan, the maintenance, and how to use it. So how they can make sure that that fan is doing what they need it to do. And again, that documentation just isn't being left. So enough on commissioning, and looking now at ventilation systems themselves. So again, another little document from approved document F. This outlines 4 ventilation systems. So system 1, as I described earlier, is your pretty traditional extractor fan. You're out of screw fix, or you know, you're stereotypical out of your catalogue type fan. System 2 is passive stack ventilation. Tend not to see this so much. You can see there you've got sort of a series of ducting and tubes that will sort of allow a natural circulation of airflow through. System 3 is continuous mechanical extract. Now, this can be in two forms. So the system you've got there is a centralized system, but you can get that decentralized as well. By that, I mean you can get a fan in each room, in moisture producing rooms, rather than something that's centralized and positioned in something like a loft. And then we've got system 4, which is your continuous mechanical supply and extract fan with heat recovery. That's your Rolls-Royce type system. If you can get it, it's more common in newer builds, but it's an all singing, all dancing, high-end system. So just to quickly look at each of those in a bit more detail, I hate this slide actually, but you know, that's your standard extractor fans, you know, what we're all familiar with, all seen thousands in our lifetimes, as it were, normally operate in a number of ways. They can be manually, they might have a humidistat, but they're intermittent, as it were. And if you've got something like that, essentially you should always just consider it a form of purge ventilation, because all it's doing is it's not continuously dealing with the issue. All it is doing is when humidity or whatever is reaching a peak, then it's used to deal with the problem. So it's not continuously providing background air or anything like that with an extractor fan like that. It's essentially just a form of purge ventilation, which is why a system like that is dependent on background ventilation. So whilst your extractor fan is pulling air out, trickle vents, and people underestimate the significance of trickle vents, but particularly in airtight buildings, more modern builds, they are there to build your background air up. And if you haven't got that, then it's going to cause you problems. And be careful with these as well. Always check that they're open, particularly on the commissioning process as well. But normally, you know, you'll find them above the windows. But if they're retrofitted as well, is another word to the wise. Actually check that they are actually gone through that. You know, I've had a couple of people tell me that they've seen them literally just screwed onto a window casing, and there is no actual ventilation through the window, and they serve no purpose. So you should also be checking that, you know, the output on each of those. There should be a number on there that gives you sort of the output. But other things to look at: undercuts under doors, and I think this is underplayed to the significance. So this is important for all ventilation systems, really, but it's vitally important to ensure you get airflow throughout the whole of the building. So undercuts to the door should have 10 mil undercut, if you've got a finished floor surface, I should add, to each of the doors to ensure that there is airflow underneath. If you've got an unfinished floor, so particularly if you're going in and doing during the commissioning phase or during the build phases, we're on a new build, but you should have 20 mil on unfinished floors. But don't underestimate sort of the significance that plays on sort of airflow throughout a property. ADF also says that system 1 and 3 ventilation systems should be designed to extract moist air as close to the moisture source as possible. So essentially in your kitchens, bathrooms. And it also, a bit of words, it gives some guidance on where it should be ducted to. So try and make sure it's away from prevailing wind, otherwise it's going to struggle to duct out there as well. System 3, I sort of alluded that there tends to be people are moving more to system 3 now. Reasons being they are continuously running, so they're always dealing with the issue rather than just sort of a form of purge ventilation, which is when the issue reaches a peak, as it were. Because they're constantly dealing with the issue, they tend not to be as noisy. They're more occupier friendly as well, because they're not turning them off and things like that. So there tends to be more of a move to this as well. And one of the other reasons is moving back to sort of this flow rate chart, as it were, from ADF. If you look, so for your kitchens with an intermittent extractor fan, you're looking at sort of 30 litres a second. With a continuous running fan, you're looking at 13 litres a second. So the rates are a lot more achievable as well. So whereas before we were looking at sort of much higher rates with intermittent extractor fans, this is, you know, it's not going to suddenly come on, make a racket, and then the occupant is going to be too, you know, concerned it's making too much noise or whatever. These are, you know, the rates are a lot more achievable. MVHR, I haven't covered passive stack because it's quite one of the more unusual ones, so I'll try and cover the more sort of more common ones. Like I say, MVHR system 4 is your Rolls-Royce systems, as it were. But it's, I say that, but it's not without fault. Usually fitted post 2010. And there's some good NHBC documentation out there about the installation of MVHR systems and faults that they've encountered. Particularly because it's a whole house system, they're difficult to retrofit. So when they do go in, they go into new builds, and when they go in, they go relatively early in the construction phase. So if you can imagine, there's ducting that will run through joists and that sort of thing. So normally they're going pretty early, and then the guy that's been in them will put it in, commission it, and then leave site. And then after that, you'll have your plasterers or whoever it may be that will go in, your dirty trades afterwards, and will make a huge amount of dust. And what this will do, you've got an extractor van that's already running because the electrician's done his bit, he's left site. These things are already running. And by the time the occupants are already in, the filters are clogged, the whole thing's knackered. So one of the problems that NHBC says, inappropriate size units as well. They found that normally people are trying to put the unit in that's too small. So normally it's working twice as hard as what it should be to get the right output rates. Lack of frost protection as well. If you tend to be 2 locations for the central unit, normally it will be in a cupboard or something like an airing cupboard type thing, or it will be in the loft. If it's in the loft, obviously, if it's an uninsulated loft, there needs to be protection there as well. One of the other issues, position, if you can imagine, because of the nature of the system, it's sort of ducted into each of the rooms. It's continually spraying, extracting and sort of a fresh supply of air. But where the makeup needs to be is sort of away from the door, so it's not sort of short-circuited as it were. So they're the sort of the 4 main systems that are highlighted in approved document F. PIV is another one which is quite popular for retrofit. So I'm conscious we're running a bit out of time, so I won't cover this in too much detail, but very easy to install. Essentially works by constantly forcing a small supply of air into a central hallway, as it were. Like I say, very popular for retrofit scenarios, but not ideal in every scenario, not ideal for every layout, because of the nature that they do have a heater element in there. But because they're forcing air in at, it's tempered air, but I think it normally, so if it's freezing cold outside, it would normally put air in at 10 degrees. So it will typically be colder than sort of the ambient temperature internally. So there needs to be a certain amount of engagement with the tenants, otherwise they may perceive it's getting cold air coming in. Poor installs for PIV as well. You know, unfortunately, you wouldn't want that in your shower, would you? Goes to show another one, because what you're doing is looking at forcing sort of you're pushing air into the built environment or into the occupied space. In this scenario, obviously, you've not got sort of a sealed loft area, as it were, so it will be forcing moisture-laden air up there and sort of recirculating, causing a problem. This is one I particularly like. So from the outside, you can see you've got a grill and then your boiler discharge. And this is a wall-mounted PIV unit there as well. So that's the PIV unit is going to be sucking air in and causing all sorts of problems. Ducting. Ducting is the devil's work. So BISRIA say that poor quality installation of flexible ducting is the principal cause of ventilation failures. And we're going to look at a number of particularly poor installs, as it were. So this is from the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide 2010, and I think it's, I'm not sure how that's coming across on the screen, but it kind of shows what a good install and what a bad install does look like. Now, I quite like this one. It's pretty clear. You can see in the top picture there, it's pulled taut. It should always be pulled to 90% of its maximum length. Flexible ducting should only be used for final connections. If it's an actual fan, there should never be more than 1.5 meters anyway. it should always be kept to a minimum. You should always use rigid ducting where possible. But final connections, obviously, I can understand the desire to use flexible ducting. It's much easier, but so it should be sort of 90% taut. If it's going through a wall, really, it should be sleeved. You don't want the sort of the peaks and troughs as well. All of those are just moisture traps. It's going to, any bends, elbows are going to reduce the flow rate as well. So difference between a good install and a pretty poor install there. And now we're going to look at some sort of real life examples, because I'm sure you're seeing them everywhere. You know, every time you go into a building, you know, and looking at flexible ducting. But this one, you know, a big thanks. I think this has come from Russell Rafton of DryFix. Thank you for that. But you can see, you know, peaks, troughs, elbows, bends. All of those bends are going to be reducing the airflow. And you've got the vertical drops there, which are just going to be ideal for any condensation occurring within that ducting. Is obviously going to come straight back down, and you can see the water staining on the plasterboard ceiling there as well. Again, similar thing, well beyond the 1.5 meters. You can see it's been sort of, you've got the carpet on the ducting as well, those vertical traps. The other thing to point out as well, you've got uninsulated ducting going through a cold void. So you've got warm moisture going up that ducting into that cold void, which is going to reduce the condensation again. And chances are, particularly we've got these huge vertical drops here, you're just going to have condensation running back out your fan. And I'm sure you'd see that. I know there's numbers of videos online where you've got condensation sort of running through extractor fans, water running back out. So another thing to look at. Similar things. Again, check where the ducting's going. How often do you find that actually when you actually do some investigation that all that's happened is that ducting terminates in the loft void? If it's even connected properly. And again, hopefully you're sucking through your teeth here as well. Similar thing, you know, it's really going to reduce. So hundreds of these, you know, the show could go on really. So this is an MVHR unit, and it just, you know, as I say, it's meant to be the Rolls Royce of installations, but, you know, look at the problems that that's going to cause. And that's what it reminds me of. Pretty poor. And one of my personal favourites, this one. So you can see that extractor fan, sort of fairly low level, just because of the roof line, as it were. Ducted out there, you know, but always check where it's going, because this is the other side of the plasterboard. So, yeah, I mean, it says it all, doesn't it? Why would you even bother, you know, the problems that's going to cause? So, well, there we are. One final sort of, well, on penultimate slide, is it second to last slide, penultimate, there we are. Discharge grilles as well. Just some of the horror shows, just check where it's going, make sure it's going, you know, it's away from any boiler discharge, as it were. Check that it's not restricted in any shape, way or form, you know, often taped over. It's rudimentary stuff, but there we are. Just to bring this right up to speed now, and ventilation and COVID-19. Now, at risk of contradicting some of the other stuff that we've put out. Now, the information I'm going to show is from the Federation of European Heating, Ventilation and Air Conditioning Association, REHAVA. Simply put, I mean, this is a guide to the document, and it's not a bad document. It's, but it's early days when it comes to the impact of COVID, as you know, we all know, we're learning on a day-by-day basis. It's a relatively new phenomenon, so we don't know essentially where we are with it. The common consensus now is that there is a risk that it can be transmitted by, you know, airborne transmission, not just sort of on contaminated surfaces, as it were. And it is now believed that it will stay in the air for up to 3 hours. So, you know, quite a long time. And this is where there's a recommendation for ventilation. Now, this document, what I find quite interesting about this one is we found a Harvard study that suggested that the COVID could be controlled by controlling moisture, humidity levels and temperature levels. Now, this study said that in the case of COVID-19. Unfortunately, this is unlikely to be the case. And it's saying that if you were looking to try and control it using these two parameters, you would be looking for above 80% RH, which we know from what we were looking at earlier would be unfeasible, and above temperatures of 30 degrees Celsius, both of which are not obtainable in the built environment. So this goes to show sort of how new this is and how conflicting some of the research is that's out there. Now, as I say, this is the guidance that's put out there through the Federation of European Heating, Ventilation, Air Conditioning Association. But that's not to say that ventilation doesn't play an important role. What it's saying is that ventilation is essential because what you need to be doing is ensuring that you have adequate air exchanges per hour or how often, ensuring that there is enough air to dilute and ensure that any sort of airborne virus that may be there is sort of diluted and sort of, out the building as quickly as possible. But it's saying do not look for parameters that are sort of humidity and temperature, because what you'd need to be getting would look to be adequate. But ventilation plays a very important part, but it's down to air exchange. So, yeah, but like I say, which is conflicting to other evidence that's out there. But just goes to show new stuff. Everyone's still trying to find their feet with it. Very conflicting. So there we are. So thank you very much for listening. I think we've probably run over by a few minutes, but there we are. Thank you.
Oh, well, all good. No, James, you're all good. Yeah, just a couple of minutes, not bad. Just being the pro that you normally are, good sir. But yeah, many thanks, James. As always, majorly informative. I mean, I had no idea 19 billion was our cost in terms of the UK economy and poor housing. I mean, that just sounds insane. And I suppose when you look at it in the sheer complexity of those 8 documents you were talking about, I mean, it just seems like a whole host of hoops that people have to jump through to try and be compliant at the moment in time. It just, for me, it needs to be made simpler.
Yeah, and actually, you make a good point. And again, a little gripe of mine. I've seen the proposed revision to approved document F. F is being looked at the moment. One of my big concerns with what they're looking to do to approve document F is look to make the ventilation rates higher. Now, for my thoughts, the problem with the ventilation at the moment is not that the rates are insufficient, is that no one's achieving the current rates, and there is the enforcement of the building regs is pretty poor. As we saw, 3 in 80 houses in new build houses are getting to the rates that we should be getting. So why are we making the goalposts further away? Why are we making it more difficult? Why are we saying that we now need to have further air, or greater ventilation rates when we're not getting what we should be getting anyway? So for my mind, we shouldn't be making it more harder to achieve. We should be making it more achievable, or helping people to achieve what we've got, rather than making the current parameters more difficult.
I hear you there. I hear you. And I suppose that's a great part of this webinar was to try and make that a little bit more clearer. I'm confused, but you can tell I've not had enough coffee this morning. Well, anyway, on to questions. Now,
well, they've got one on fire doors. I've just seen that one, so let me answer that one fairly quick. Yeah, obviously that 10 mil gap doesn't apply to fire doors, and you'd have to comply with your own building regs on which is obviously part B. But yeah, exclude fire doors. But if you're looking at your typical domestic dwelling, where you're looking at your bedroom settings and all of that, then you're going to be looking at your standard stuff there. So
perfect. Well, yeah. Well, first question. Right. So it comes from Paul Aiken. So he's mentioned appreciate everything that you mentioned about compliant ventilation, but what more can we do to try and encourage natural ventilation than getting mechanical ventilation?
Well, depends where you're going, doesn't it? What do you consider natural ventilation, and where would building tight and ventilating right seems to be the mantra at the moment, doesn't it? So I completely get that. natural ventilation will work if you've got a lot of air coming into a building naturally. But then, you know, the building regs suggest that actually you want to try and moderate the amount of sort of uncontrolled air coming in, as it were, and try and make sure that what you can do is, as I say, ventilate right. So it's a difficult one. You know, if you want a naturally ventilated building, you can. But, you know, and if there isn't a problem, you've got enough air, that's fine. But how, you know, if there's not a problem, there's not a problem, is there? And particularly in existing builds. But I don't know. I'm not. Natural ventilation is a difficult one to try and.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that everyone uses properties in different ways, and so it's then looking at well.
Why? Sorry, Andy, I've seen this one. Why are we trying to make our buildings airtight? Well, the reason is energy efficiency. The building regs L1A, L1B. You know, the simple the less air exchange we have in the better it's retaining heat it is. But the problem is system one is I get that it's a system one.
I think to sum it off, Paul, it's almost like a catch-22. Do you know, if you want your property to be lovely, warm, not cold in the winter, well, you're going to trap the heat in. You're going to trap all that air in. So then how are you going to kind of circulate it out? I mean, James, I totally hear you. Totally hear. But moving on, next question, because I'm conscious of time. Next question comes from...
Can I look at John Bradley? John Bradley's made a point here. System one is a natural ventilation system. Yeah, I mean, by naturally, if you're referring to, intermittent extractor fan being a purge ventilation in the background through, if you're looking at it like that, then, I completely get that.
Okay. Well, next question, Clark, comes from Clark Elsby. Where a subcontractor is instructed, would they not be held responsible for testing the system and ensuring that it complies with regulations? And she's now added something to this as well. She's also he has also added who would be responsible for contacting building control?
So say that again. What's the first part of the question?
First part is, would a subcontractor not be held responsible for testing the system and ensuring that it complies with regulations? Second part is, who would be responsible for contacting building control?
Wow. So it depends. If it's being installed by a competent person, it's obviously the competent person that's going to be. So the installer. If it's going in beforehand, it should be who is installed. Well, whoever the designer of the system is, as it were, whoever's sort of, if it's so post, if it's a competent person, they should be doing it, and whoever, the builder, essentially, whoever's putting the extractor fan in, if they're not a competent person, should be doing it. It's down to them. They're the person that is in the knowledge. They're the one that should know. I wouldn't put the onus on the occupant if that's what they're referring to, because why would they know? If the builder should know, that they're the ones that should know about the building regs.
Okay. Well, next question again. Sorry, guys, I'm rushing on here again. I'm conscious of time. Next question comes from Gavin McCall. Should a surveyor be looking at the air management systems during the course of a level 2 or 3 survey?
Yes.
Simple as that. There you go. Quick answers. Love it. Moving on then.
And if they're not, they should refer to a specialist, I think. Because, and this is, it's when they're there and they're not, even if they're unsure and they can't test it or whatever, what happens if someone moves in and they get a house full of mold because the ventilation system wasn't adequate? Should that be picked up by, it's a dampness in the property. So, yeah.
All righty. Well, okay. Moving on. Now, this question comes from, well, it's not actually a question. It's more actually following on some comments that were actually made. The initial comment was made by David Reynolds, which he noted that when he visited Australia, the houses and premises, and they all had powerful extractors in the kitchens, the bathrooms, etc., that were performing really, really well. I suppose what the key question is, why is the UK so behind the curve?
Well, I can't, I've been to Australia, but I can't say at the point I was, you know, I was in my 20s, and extractor fans were well off my agenda at that point. But why are we behind? Well, I think it's, you know, enforcement of the building regs. I think this is, and one of the other sort of soapbox speeches I meant to try and make is we get quite caught up, particularly post Grenfell, on Part B, and the fire regs. Part P has always got a lot of attention because if anyone dies from those, they get a lot of attention. You know, it's quite a cruel and you know, the it's you know, explosive way to go, as it were. Whereas over here, you know, Part F, if ventilation isn't right, they kind of get away with it. There's no enforcement of it, and that is, I think, why they kind of get away. And I don't think it should. It's not right. You know, ultimately, it still affects the health of the occupants, and I think there should be greater control on, or greater emphasis on making sure that all of the building regs are adhered to and sort of compliant.
And I will throw out this. I mean, I don't pretend to be a massively world traveller, but I have been about there. I mean, I wouldn't say that the UK is behind the curve. I mean, I would say, yeah, certainly in Australia, I can understand it in terms of temperatures and air conditioning and etc., why they've invested so much time down that way. But when I think of countries like Spain, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, I can't see them miles ahead of us. If anything, actually, I see us ahead of them. So it's it might be the case that maybe one or two countries, yeah, are ahead.
I don't know their systems well enough to be able to comment and say, you know, are we behind? You know.
I do see it. Petra's just put a comment there, just saying building control in Australia is pretty tight. Again, I don't pretend to know anything about the building control side of things. You're much more of an expert than me.
Well, you know, we clearly know off the back of the Hackett report that the current system, there are flaws in it. They've been highlighted, and now it's time for them to be, you know, adjusted and changed. I mean, we're told, and you know, in certain terms that change is coming. We should all be ready and ready to embrace it. Personally, I'm a bit dubious that, you know, that was several years ago we were hearing that, and I'm not sure there has been sufficient change yet. And, you know, looking particularly what I see with approved document F, I'm not sure that the changes are heading in the right direction. It seems to be the same people making the same decisions and actually not getting anywhere where we should. But that's a personal, I'm sure. People have got conflicting opinions to that, I'm sure.
Well, folks, here, just to let you know, we're almost done. I've just got two more questions for James that I'm going to throw at him. I'll send James the other kind of questions. If you can actually get back to folks, then great. So if you can, folks, if you can just hold on to us just for a couple more minutes. But second last question. Now, this actually comes from a Mr. Anonymous, and I can understand why when I read you the question. So, Mr.
Why do I feel nervous about that already? Go on.
No, don't feel nervous. But he posted, how can we make money out of fans when they can get bought and being queued for 40 quid and fitted by a plumber? I suppose, why?
Well, has that, and which is fair enough, but hasn't that been the whole point of this webinar? That's what's going on. That's what's going wrong. And they're not doing what they should be doing. And yes, it can be installed by those people, but it's being done wrong. Come to people that can do it properly, whilst there might be a greater, you know, it might cost a little bit more. Why would you, you know, cut corners? And what's the point? Ultimately, you'll be throwing your money down the drain. If you're paying a plumber to do it and it's not installed properly, why are you paying them at all? Because it's not going to work. It's not going to do what it's meant to be doing. Go to someone that knows what they're doing. Make sure they know how they're going to, what they can commission it and do it in accordance with building regs. Then ultimately, it's going to cost more, but there is money to be made there. So, you know, there needs to be this move away from, you know, cheap work. And this is what I was hoping, you know, particularly off the back of Grenfell and things like that this race to the bottom that Judith Hackett mentioned, that everyone's to get out there to get things done as cheap as possible. We need to move away from that sort of mantra. It's not about doing things cheap and you know, half-hearted, but actually about doing things properly. We should be, and that's, you know, the one thing that I want to try and sort of preach through this.
Okay. Well, last question. It's not really a question. It's more of a kind of comment. Comes from Les Hill. Well, hello, Les. He's saying, James, when are we going to have a competition for the worst examples of ducking? Or ducting?
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? Why don't we have that now? You know, on the hoof, why don't we get people to send in their worst ones? And, you know, and perhaps we can make a little bit of a feature or something out of it and go from there. So, yeah, send them to me. And, you know, perhaps we can have a bit of a laugh and a bit of a chuckle. And you know, if you've got a particularly bad install, let's send it in.
Okay, well, you heard James there, folks. Send it over to himself. But here, just for those looking for additional information, if I can point you over to our damp and ventilation document library, you'll be able to find some best practice guides and further information and guidance as well. The URL is just up on the screen there. It's just www.property-care.org/ventilation library. Also, just to let you know, I'm really chuffed to say that our training is now back up and running. We have several training courses in this particular area associated with ventilation. See two of them up there, evaluating ventilation in existing buildings, and also a more technical one, which is the diagnostic approach to understanding condensation, atmospheric moisture, and mold, where we look at the toys which you guys can actually use in order to help come to better conclusions within the property. Just before signing off, just to let you know about our next webinar coming up, which is going to last of our weekly webinars before we switch back to our monthly webinars, and it features our very own CEO, Steve Hodgson, who's going to be talking about dealing with the effects of damp and the principles and considerations. Now, it's very much a different kind of view on looking at damp. I've already seen some of his slides. Looks really quirky, very interesting. Looking forward to it. But if you are interested in signing up for it, the URL is there, just property-care.org/webinars. Last but not least, I just want to say a big thank you to yourself, James, for coming on board, delivering that presentation. A big thank you to everyone that joined us this morning as well. All it really leaves me to say is hopefully you all enjoyed it, and to wish you all, hopefully, a lovely rest of the day. Take care, everyone.